Okay, class, so now our next lesson for understanding the self is lesson 2, the self, society, and culture. Okay, so the objectives of this lesson are the following. So at the end of this lesson, you should be able to, first, explain the relationship between and among the self, society, and culture. Second, describe and discuss the different ways by which society and culture shape the self. Third, compare and contrast how the self can be influenced by the different institutions in the society. And lastly, examine one's self against the different views of self that were discussed in the class. Okay, now let's define self. So according to literature, the self has these characteristics. First, separate. Second, self-contained. Third, consistency. Fourth, unitary. And fifth, private. Let's start with the separate. Separate means that the self is distinct from other selves, the other selves. The self is always unique and has its own identity. To simply explain this is that if person A and person B has the sense of self, their sense of selves are different. It cannot be the same. So that's why it's called separate. Second, self-contained and independent, because in itself it can exist. Its distinctness allows it to be self-contained with its own thoughts, characteristics, and volition, meaning that our sense of self is independent to others. We have our own thoughts, characteristics, and volition. So for example, person A has its own thoughts, characteristics, and volition, and it can be different or the same with person B. That's why we have different political views, religious views, and opinions, because our sense of self is contained and independent. Third, it is consistent, meaning that a particular self's traits, characteristics, tendencies, and potentialities are more or less the same. So meaning that our characteristics are consistent throughout the time. It can be changed, but it's still consistent. The way we walk, the way we dress, the way we the way we behave can be consistent all the time. It can be altered, but it depends on us. That leads us to the next one, which is unitary. Unitary in that is the center of all experiences and thoughts that run through a certain person, meaning we are the center of ourselves. We are the ones who's capable of our thoughts and experiences. We are the ones who make it. That's why it's unitary. Lastly, it is private, meaning that each person sorts out information, feelings, and emotions and thought processes within the self. This whole process is never accessible to anyone but the self, meaning ourselves. I am the one who is responsible on how we feel, how we process things, how we think on things. And no one can know that. No one can hear that. We are responsible and only are the ones who knows it. That's why. Now let's define the self and culture. How does the culture affects the self? Now let's go to the definition of Marcel Mauss. So according to Marcel Mauss, the self has two faces, the moi and the person. I think it's person. Okay, so the moi in here refers to a person's sense of who he is, his body, and his basic identity, his biological givenness. So moi in here only refers to the biological aspect of the self, the biological things that we can see on ourselves. We are short, we are tall. That's the sense of self. That's the first one. And then the second one is the person, which is composed of the social concepts of what it means to be who he is. So it depends on how the society looks at us. So in here, if moi is on the biological, person is on the social aspects. It focuses on what the society tells us. Are we rich, poor, Or are we intelligent? Not so much. Kind, talented, and many more. So that's Bershawn. Now, culture affects, or culture, one of the main predictors of the self in culture is the language. Language is another interesting aspect of this social constructivism. It is salient part of culture and ultimately has a tremendous effect in our crafting of the self. So here in our country, in the Philippines, there are a lot of regions. There are a lot of islands in here in the Philippines, and each island has its unique language. So if you go to Luzon in NCR specifically, most of the people here speaks Tagalog, and because of Tagalog, we have our own kind of music, which is OPM. Our genre would be OPM. But also, there's another kind of, the OPM is not only limited to what the Luzon kind of music has. If you go to Visayas, their language would be Bisaya. So they also have the OPM, but it's a mixture of rap and a beatbox something, or a pop kind of genre. So as you can see here, if a person lives in Metro Manila and he or she transfers to Visayas, there would be a great impact because the language differences there are different, and because the language are different, the culture is different as well. It is, if a self is born into a particular society or culture, the self will have to adjust according to its exposure. That's what I've mentioned a while ago. Now let's talk about how is the social world affects the development of the sense of self. Okay, so more than his givenness, personality, tendencies, and propensities, among others, one is believed to be in active participation in the shaping of the self. So, society itself can actually mold in the development and shaping of the self. Men and women in their growth and development engage actively in the shaping of the self. So, if a person or a child grew up in a female environment, he or she will have a different culture than a person who grows up in an environment that is filled with a mixture of girls and boys. That would be different. Okay. And the unending terrain of metamorphosis of the self is mediated by language. So right now, I believe that there are different kind of languages that we encounter today. That's not limited to Tagalog or English or other dialects that we have here in the Philippines. The other languages that we have right now are also digital languages. So we also have digital languages, I don't know, SML, share mo lang. SKL, share ko lang. Diba? We have different kind of languages, and this kind of languages actually affects the sense of self. Now let's go to Mead and Vygotsky. So Mead and Vygotsky are very famous in psychology. For them, language has a very big impact in the development of the sense of self of an individual. Now let's see. For Mead and Vygotsky, the way that the human persons develop is with the use of language, acquisition, and interaction with others. So both Vygotsky and Mead treat the human mind as something that is made, constituted through language as experienced in the external world and as encountered in the dialogues with others. So, for Mead and Vygotsky, language is acquired, and once a child acquired it, it does not only acquire the language, but it also acquired the way how it is expressed as a language. And because of the behavior, how the language was expressed, was acquired by the child, the sense of self also develops. Now, families also contribute a lot in the development of self. The kind of family that we are born in, the resources available to us, human, spiritual, economic, and the kind of development that we will have will certainly affect us. So if a child was born in a very spiritual kind of environment, the tendency of the child will will grow up as a spiritual kind of person as well. Or if a child was able to grow up in an environment where there's a lack of food, probably the child will grow up looking for food. Or if the child was able to grow up in a complete family, the child will also look forward on having a complete family in the future as well, or will also be comfortable in living in a complete family. But that doesn't necessarily mean that a child who doesn't have a complete family will have a different perspective. It might be the same or different depending on the child. So human beings are born virtually helpless, and the dependency period of a human baby to its parents for nurturing is relatively longer than most other animals. So as you can see here, a child is helpless, was born helpless and dependent. So if a child wasn't able to get that much help and that much dependence, it will also affect its sense of self. In trying to achieve the goal of becoming a fully realized human, a child enters a system of relationships, most important of which is the family. So as you can see, when a child was new here on earth, yes, sanggol pa lamang, the child will realize or will also get or acquire the kind of social interaction that his mother and father are giving to him or her. And with that, the sense of self also develops. Human persons learn the ways of living and therefore their selfhood by being in a family. It is what a family initiates a person to become that serves as a basis for this person's progress. That's why may mga kasabihan na sinasabi na kaya siguro ganyan siya because lumaki siya sa nanay na ganyan or sa tatay na ganyan, or kaya ganyan siya kasi pamilya niya ganyan. Because as you can see, the family where a person grew up affects his or her sense of self or self throughout the years. Now this part is probably the last part of this presentation. Now let's talk about gender and the self. So gender is one of the loci of the self that is subject to alteration, change, and development. So as you can see here, it can be altered. Okay, so just to avoid confusion, sex and gender are different. Sex is assigned to us at birth, and gender is something that we can choose if a person wants to. Okay, so a sex can be born as male or female, but a gender can be girl or boy. All right, so sex is something that is assigned to us and that you cannot alter. Gender is something that you can. Alright? So the sense of self that is being taught makes sure that an individual fits in a particular environment, is dangerous and detrimental in the goal of truly finding one's self-determination and growth of the self. So as mentioned in here, if an individual was forced to do or was forced to be something else than what he or she really feels, that would be dangerous and detrimental. So it is important to give one of the leeway to find, express, and live his identity. Okay, so in psychology, it is very important for us that an individual will able to express his or herself. Okay, this is to avoid mental health conditions, psychiatric disorders, and mental health disorders. All right, so if someone was forced to act what the society wants to, that would be a grave threat to the sense of self of the individual. So gender has to be personally discovered and asserted and not dictated by culture and the society. All right, so as mentioned in here by the book, gender is something that we can choose to. All right, others can choose and others cannot. Others don't want to. All right, that depends. So in here, some gender should be something that is not dictated by someone else, not dictated by anyone, even the president of or someone or anyone else, specifically the society. All right, that's gender. Gender is different to sex. Again, gender is different to sex. All right, so again, like what the book says, gender should not be dictated by anyone else. All right, so that's the lesson that we have today about the understanding the self, lesson 2. Thank you.